Boom.
Good afternoon, everybody, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us for the Tim and Jim Show. We have a special guest today who happens to also be named Tim. And so I'm going to have Jim Fuse introduce the other Tim today.
Yes, and I'm very excited to get to introduce who I consider a friend, Tim Lewis of Stone and Press. It's funny how social media seems to work sometimes. Tim and I think, kind of knew each other virtually for a while, and then we both were at Social Media Marketing World in San Diego last year, and we actually got to meet, of all places, drinking beer at the post Social Media Marketing World craft beer tour, and so we got a chance to talk and learn a bit more about each other, and I think we've been chatting much more ever since. And so Tim is a remarkable man, has a remarkable story, and just recently published a book on social media networking. And and I read it. It's a great book available on Amazon. I'll let you tell you more about that. So Tim, tell us about yourself, and we're excited to have you here today.
Well, I met you on a beer tour, as we know, as we already discussed. I'm based in the United Kingdom, so that's London, that big city in the middle of Europe. I started off actually learning to self-publish my own time travel and fantasy books. So I started as a fiction writer rather than and I ended up getting interested in social media and how people use that to try and sell books. So it's kind of funny how things work. So I ended up in basically trying to sell like fantasy and time travel books, and ended up getting really interested in social media and marketing that way. So that's kind of where I come from. Stone and Press is my publishing company, which I used to basically run my to publish my books. So that's why my Twitter handle was Stone and Press, even though I'm Tim Lewis. So Tim Lewis, every single possibility of that name has been taken on Twitter, and every single company name that's remotely got Tim or Lewis in it is totally taken. So I just went for Stoneham, which is I was born in Russell Stoneham Hospital, which doesn't exist anymore. It's somewhere in South London. So that's where the Stoneham comes from. But I also discovered after I set up that name that there's a suburb of Boston called Stoneham. So I keep getting people messaging me, asking me if I'm in Boston, but I'm not in Boston.
And I see we've got another publisher out in the studio audience, Lindsay Anderson, who recently wrote a book, The Click Technique. So Lindsay, thank you for joining us today. It's always good to see Lindsay. So Tim, I'll let you start. Tim Sohn, because I got to remember there's two Tims today. Tim, we'll let you start the questions for today.
Well, thank you for the honor, Jim Fuse. Oh, I didn't get my hands in. I'm so skinny, but not really. Anyway, Tim Lewis, question number 1. What made you get into self-publishing?
Well, strangely enough, I've never ever really wanted to be traditionally published. I ended up self-publishing because I started becoming a fan of reading self-published books. I know that sounds a little bit odd, but when I was still working in the grotty world of IT, financial IT, as an IT manager, I'd often basically buy loads of new self-published Kindle books. And I got really interested in the fact that, I mean, some of the books were terrible, to be fair, and this has always been an issue with self-publishing. But there were so many brilliant books and so many different subjects that were in basically self-published books, certainly non-fiction. And also a lot of self-published fiction was very, very creative and very innovative. So it kind of appealed to me in that regard. And I ended up in my notice period, I was going to, originally I was going to do like IT contract work. So I gave up my job and I was going to, in a notice period of 3 months, but I read this book called Write, Publish, Repeat, where these fiction authors were talking about how they were basically producing all of these fictional books. So like they were writing sort of cowboy Western books, but they were writing a book a month and they almost had this production line of a business. And I thought, this is actually way more of a fun thing to do than IT contract work. And I had kind of the financial means to take the risk and take the jump to actually start self-publishing my own books. So that's how I got into self-publishing. But a lot of people who start off self-publishing don't realize that self-publishing and business are very related. And business and self-publishing are actually related. It makes sense for an awful lot of people who are just in business generally for themselves to self-publish their own books. And it makes a lot of sense for people who self-publish to understand the business side of things. They're not as far apart as people maybe would think. So that's how I got started in self-publishing anyway.
So, Tim, what do you think keeps potential writers from publishing? And also, to your point of, I think that is a very interesting point you brought up earlier about how maybe writers don't realize it's not just writing, it's a business.
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing that stops people from writing their own books are two big issues. One I suffered from, which was not really knowing how to finish a book. I was somebody who had like loads of half-finished Word documents where I'd started writing a novel or I'd started writing a non-fiction book and I got stuck somewhere in the middle and I'd given up. That is a big... So people don't even get the book finished. I mean, that's one of the big issues. They get disheartened or they feel that there's still this kind of idea, certainly amongst older people in my generation, that self-publishing isn't a thing and that it's like you have to go with a traditional publisher because that's what you do, sort of thing. And that was what was the case until like sort of about 2009, 2010 time. There have been two big innovations that really changed publishing in the 21st century, which are the introduction of Kindle and Kindle devices, and also print-on-demand technology. So Kindle are those Kindle devices where you've got ebooks on. Now, they've made a big difference because you can self-publish to a Kindle device and get 70% royalties for the sales of those ebooks. And that makes it so much more profitable for somebody to self-publish a book. And there isn't any gateway. Anybody can set up a KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing account, and publish onto a Kindle device. Admittedly, there are some costs involved to that, but not many. There is actually no cost to create a Kindle Direct Publishing account and to publish a book. So that was one of the big things that's changed self-publishing to make it kind of acceptable. And the other is print on demand. So, for example, this book is print on demand. So it used to be the case that if you created a book and you were a publisher, you had to do a print run to make it financially viable. But now with print on demand, if you order my book on Amazon, it will go to one of Amazon's print setters and it'll print one copy and send that copy to you. And that just makes it so much better for self-publishers because, I mean, the costs are higher than if you do a print run, but you don't have to basically buy 500 books and have them sitting in your garage and send them to people, which is what you used to have to do before in the 20th century. So that's what's changed self-publishing to make it much more cost-effective and practical for just general people to do.
That sounds so funny saying the 20th century. It sounds so long ago.
Oh, no, yeah.
So Tim, talk a little bit about, for people who are interested in getting involved in self-publishing, what are some of the first steps people should take? How do you get started?
Well, the first thing that I suggest to people, and this is a little bit of a personal preference, but for me, it was really something that made a big difference, is to create a plan for your book. Now, I know there are people like Stephen King who don't plan their books at all, and they just write it straight off. But I think for like 99% of people, to have some kind of structure to how they're... So this is almost like writing like one sheet of paper could be enough, and just writing the chapters down of what your book is going to be about. Because personally, for me, using that approach as opposed to the previous, like, I'll try and write it and see where I get, it helps you get back on track when you get lost. Because the first important thing is to actually finish your first draft of the book. It doesn't matter how many mistakes are in it or if it needs to be edited. Once you have something finished, just from a psychological point of view, that makes so much difference. It really does. And then you've got the editing process. The editing process takes ages. But I think basically it's getting the book finished into some kind of state is the main thing that holds people back from self-publishing, and is the best tip. Then you need to spend the time to think about things like marketing, and it's very easy to underestimate the amount of time that it takes to do things. Even like if you want to have your books stocked in bookstores, you need to have an ISBN number, which is basically, you see that on the back of the books, there's like barcodes, and there's a number above it. That's an ISBN number. It's just an identification number for the book. But depending on where you are in the world, those numbers can take a while to arrive. So you may think, oh, I want to publish my book tomorrow, and then you find you need an ISBN number. You haven't got one. So there is a certain amount of planning involved to really get a book. And especially if you set yourself a hard release date, then it can be quite tough. I mean, that's what I did with this book. And I'm not sure I'll ever do that again. I did put it on pre-order 3 months beforehand. And that really puts you under pressure to finish it. I finished it just about, but I'm not sure I'd do that approach again.
So Tim, and I know you really have relished self-publishing, and you kind of taken things with that to a whole nother level when you came about with a podcast. And so can you tell us about the podcast and where's the best people to listen to that podcast?
Okay, well, my podcast is the Begin Self-Publishing one. You can see a little symbol of what the thing looks behind me. And I think I'm on episode about 141 now. So it's been going for about 3 years. It's kind of again a depressingly long amount of time. I started out rather naively thinking I'd do a show, and I do about 20 episodes, and I'll be able to say everything about how to start self-publishing. And I kind of did about 20 episodes, and then I started interviewing people about topics about marketing and self-publishing. Then I did about another 80 or 100 episodes, which were mainly, I was interviewing people about all sorts of topics. Recently, I've changed the format again so that now I'm following people on their self-publishing journey, giving them advice as they go along. So there's 3 people I'm helping at the moment, Jen Cole, Making Sang, and Ben Roberts. And I'm basically following them along with their journey as to how they're doing their self-publishing thing. And this has been good for me to actually be able to help people with my knowledge from all the previous episodes that I'd accumulated. And it's also good for them because it gives them a bit of accountability to actually get their project done. So that's the current format of the show. You can find it at beginselfpublishing.com, or it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Stitcher Radio, it's on Spotify. Believe it or not, you can get podcasts on Spotify now if you're on an Android device. And I'm not sure where else it can. iHeartRadio as well, I think it's on as well. So most good podcast places you can find the show if you're interested.
That's great. So Tim Lewis, what have you found have been some of the most effective strategies you've used to get the word out about your books, self-published books, to market them?
Well, the most effective strategy I've used, as opposed to the most effective strategies out there, is not necessarily the same thing. I think it depends on what kind of book it is, which is a bit of a kind of a general answer. But for fiction books, one of the things that really works is these aggregated email list services. They're not well known necessarily, but there are services like BookBub, where people sign up to an email list, and every day they get a series of books, and you can pay to put your book in those services. Now, most of them have a high requirement in terms of the number of reviews for a book. So they need 25-star reviews, and they need a 4.5 average before they'll list your book in their service. And those are the best way by far to sell fiction books. So if you're selling fantasy or something along those lines. More generally, one of the things that's unique about books is that the Amazon ecosystem itself is fantastic for almost like a self-fueled marketing engine. So if you can get your book into a chart in Amazon that sells really well, So let's say you write a social media book and you get your book into the social media chart. You will get people who buy that book because they see it in the chart. And that is something that's kind of special, I think, for book marketing as opposed to other things. So the Amazon system itself is almost like a marketing engine. And I've had this happen basically for one book, really. I had it a little bit for this book. My first book I wrote about was just a time travel novella. I paid for Facebook advertising at the time to just push it into the UK time travel chart. And that caused a load of sales on the back of it, way more than the original Facebook ad. Now, this was 2015, I think, 16. So Facebook advertising was a lot easier to do in those days. I don't think you could do the same approach now. But there is something about just that push. Book marketing is all about getting enough people to buy your book in a short period of time to get it into a chart. And then you need to get the buzz from beyond that. So that much more applies to non-fiction, because the non-fiction charts are a lot easier to chart in than the fiction charts. There's generally a lot less sales. I've always had on my podcast, I need to have this guy back again. There's this guy from Germany who does all these analysis of all the Kindle charts, sales charts. And there are some sales charts where you can get to number one with telling 2 books. And I actually did game this with the latest book. I am now officially a number 1 Amazon bestseller.
All right.
But I totally scammed it. I scammed it as an experiment, and because I wanted to say I was a number 1 Amazon bestseller. But my social media book, because I have a chapter about how I visited Wichita in Kansas, I put the book into United States Travel Kansas, and it got to number 1. Because there's about 2 books about Indian trails, I think, in that category, and then there's my book. But this is kind of this is one of the things. I don't think I'll get any sales from that book, but I got into some of the UK social media charts, about number 9 or number 8 in those categories. I think I got sales from those. So it's kind of like anything. It's like, it's what you're trying to do. But I think the charts, understanding the Amazon ecosystem helps a lot with book marketing. People will talk about word of mouth, but you need a certain amount of kind of connections before you do that. With this book, it really helped to the fact that I had 20 people whose contributions I got in the book. So they were useful for helping to promote the book as well. Though, if I was doing this kind of anthology book again, where I've interviewed lots of people, I would focus much more on setting up an email list of getting them to get people to subscribe to an email list, because I didn't do that this time. So they pushed it out there onto their social media, but the trouble is social media is very time delayed. People see posts like days later. So I think email has that advantage of when it's going to be hopefully delivered. I mean, a lot of people won't see it anyway because of spam, but it's much more effective reach than social media in terms of timing. So I think email marketing is very important for books as well.
So when you said you created a Facebook ad a few years ago. So did you sent people actually to the Amazon page with the link in the ad?
I did at the time, yes. I mean, I would like to be able, and I did try it then. I haven't done Facebook advertising that recently. I did try it a few years ago for books. It's become less and less, because books are such low value products. It's become less and less kind of profitable. I know people who do it, but they usually do it when they've got a series of like 10 fiction books. So let's say you've got 14 zombie books in a series. Pushing book number 1 is often worthwhile because you'll get all the sale through of all the people buying the later books. But if you've just got one book and it's like $2.99 or something, then trying to push Facebook ads to it. But anyway, back to the point we were talking about, which I've wandered off. Going directly to Amazon or other pages works so much better than sending it to your website and then people have to choose the Amazon or Kobo or whatever site to go to. So, I mean, I'm not sure you would necessarily use Facebook advertising. I mean, Facebook advertising is obviously popular, but there are things like promoted pins, Bing ads. There are lots of other cheap places, way cheaper to get cold traffic than Facebook ads. Facebook ads are fantastic for targeting, but unless your book is almost identical to another book. So if you wrote, say, a vampire book that was almost identical to Twilight, or something like that, then you could market to that audience precisely on Facebook.
Right.
And that kind of makes sense. But if your book is nothing like anything else and you've no idea what the targeting is, then it's kind of like, well, is Facebook advertising the right platform for you? People push Facebook advertising because everybody knows Facebook advertising. But I don't think it's the cheapest place to get like paid traffic at the moment.
Sure. Lindsay Anderson, who is one of our viewers here, we'd love if you have any comments down below. Lindsay recently published a book, so we'd be curious about your experience, and if you want to put a link down below to your book, that would be welcome, Lindsay. It seems as though Jim has disappeared. Can you still hear me, Tim, and see me?
I can hear you, yes. Jim got confused.
Okay. Jim seems to be frozen. Okay. Well, we'll keep going.
Is this that Han Solo in Carbonite, Jim?
Now it's the Tim and Tim show.
It's the Tim and Tim show, yeah.
Yes. What about have you tried using other social media platforms to promote your books? Like, I know you have a big following on Twitter.
I have tried Twitter advertising. It's one of those things where I did actually come up with an idea about how to use Twitter advertising, but the trouble is now I'm pretty sure that that approach is totally illegal.
Oh, no.
Well,
what was your approach?
Well, one of the things that you could do with Twitter, and you could actually conceivably do it with Facebook, but you could upload what's called a tailored audience in Twitter, and you could upload individual Twitter handles. So you could create a list or a spreadsheet full of Twitter handles and upload it as a custom tailored audience. Right. The trouble is with like data protection and GDPR and all the rest of it, they've changed it now that you have to say where you've got this list from. You can't just create one. Or you could have conceivably done lots of data mining of everybody's tweets and found groups of people who did particular things, because the actual Twitter advertising platform is not very good at that. It'll let you target towards people who follow stuff or mention a hashtag, but it won't let you just say, I want to do all of these things. I mean, I've never really seen anybody use Twitter advertising that effectively. Apart from for events are very good, because if you've got, so I've seen people like the Eurovision Song Contest, there was the chocolate manufacturer like putting in like funny things related to that. So people who were looking at the hashtag, I've seen that kind of thing work well, but I've never seen anybody do it that well for books.
Okay. So tell people, sorry, there seems to be an echo, but tell people how they can find you online, website, social media, things like that. Maybe Jim is coming back.
Eurovision Song Contest, there was the chocolate manufacturer putting in like funny things related to that. So people who were looking at the hashtag.
We're re-listening to our show right now.
We do it that well for books.
Okay. So tell people, sorry, there's supposed to be an echo, but tell people, it seems like somebody is playing the show.
He's got our show on a delay of about 20 seconds.
Hello, Jim. Can you hear us? Jim? Are you there, Jim?
I broadcast for the drama.
So tell people, sorry.
He's genuinely got a delay of like, he's going to get this delay in 30 seconds, presumably. So
yeah. Anyway, sorry, go ahead. Tell people how they can connect with you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that's him doing it for 20 seconds ago or not. Maybe Jim's genuinely in the past now. He's like, let's talk about time travel. He's actually from the past.
Oh, look, he put his name above him.
Yeah. Anyway, people can find me. I'm at the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast.com for the podcast, stoneandpress.com for my books and for speaking. And I've got some links to some videos of me speaking about social media.
Excellent.
I'm on LinkedIn as Tim Lewis, though it's almost impossible to find me on LinkedIn as Tim Lewis because it's such a common name. But you can search for Stone and Press, and there's only one Stone and Press on Twitter, and I'm the only employee of Stone and Press on LinkedIn. On Twitter, I'm Stone and Press. On Instagram, I'm Stone and Press. On Facebook, I'm Tim Lewis, but again, it's almost impossible to find me unless you happen to be in a group with me. Though I'm a friend of Jim and Tim, so you may be able to find me that way. And yes, that's it. I've probably forgotten some major network that I'm on, but yes, I'm Stone and Press basically everywhere apart from LinkedIn.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Tim and Jim. And that's about it. And we will see you guys again soon. Thanks a lot.
And Jim's probably going to get this in 20 seconds time.
Probably. Bye, everybody.